Welcome to my first of a series of video live streams on restorative education, the movement that I'm trying to start. Let me start with a basic explanation of the movement. Restorative education is a movement founded on the belief that education is the key to restoring lives if we are to live as whole humans. We need to constantly be learning how to heal the damage of being living, both physically and mentally. And that is where restorative education comes in. And we are starting with what I feel is the core conceptual problem most people have in understanding how education can be used to restore lives, families, communities, and that is the general conception of intelligence itself, which has kind of become so twisted that most have beliefs about what intelligence is that they're just not consistent with the science, not consistent with the physics, the biology, the neurology, not consistent with social development, or even the day to day, on the ground realities of the person's life. The definition I'm going to present today, I believe, is truly useful and can help you start to unlock those amazing powers of problem solving that I just spoke about, those powers that we all possess. So let's start with what is out there for definitions of intelligence. Ironically, I found the first place that I actually looked on Google gave me what I consider to be a pretty good definition. This is probably since they're an AI company, and that research is compelling them to think a little bit more deeply than most and attempt to remove really what's one of the chief cognitive biases that people hold around intelligence. And that is that intelligence is a strictly human thing. And for this reason, Google's definition is pretty good. But the biggest thing I want you to notice is how simple the definition is. It has two basic components, the ability to acquire knowledge and the ability to apply it. Another thing that makes this a good definition of intelligence is that you can actually use it to identify the phenomenon. It doesn't use any squishy evaluatory language like correctly or quickly or easily. These are all relative terms that are mostly meaningless unless grounded in some sort of real life benchmark. Easily, compared to what? Quickly compared to what? Because it's so abstract, defining intelligence runs the risk of being little more than like a general vibe, an internal feeling that you might have, like an emotion, which I want to stress are real things, but they're abstract. They're part of our internal world. So if we are going to define them meaningfully, we have to connect them with the outside world, to their behavioral expression. So take sadness, for example. This is an abstract mental state that we identify through behaviors like frowning or crying. However, if intelligence is an abstract mental state, which underpins our ability to acquire knowledge and skills, well, then that means that virtually any piece of knowledge or skill expression in itself could be identified as a marker of intelligence, leading to definitions of intelligence that get more and more convoluted as more and more skills and bits of knowledge are added to a growing bucket list without ever getting any closer to the core of what intelligence really is. Notice this is what is happening to the APA's definition right now. Instead of just two elements, well, now you find about, I think, five or six things like derive information, learn from experience, adapt to the environment, and understand. But the part that I thought was really kind of a bit problematic was the phrase correctly utilize thought and reason, which, the American Psychiatric Association should realize can be a slippery turn of phrase when you're describing the concept of intelligence. Problem only gets worse kind of the deeper you dig. Merriam-Webster had several definitions of intelligence, and I actually left a couple out because they were talking about, stuff like military intelligence, things like that. And I just want to focus on the aspects of the definition that are related to the mind. But what gets really interesting when you go and you look at these various definitions of intelligence is how surprisingly, different they are in their defining features. For example, here, the Cambridge Dictionary, it doesn't even mention many of the qualities found in that APA or Merriam-Webster's definition, and it adds some elements like judgment and opinion to the definition. And it adds some squishy language also, the terms quickly and easily, which I find are particularly problematic when talking about intelligence, largely because we know that time is used differently in different situations. In some situations, slow, deliberate thinking, what may be identified as something that a highly intelligent person might be doing. For example, Albert Einstein, he felt that it was his ability to sit with a problem and think about it for a very long time that made his thinking special. And that is something that, generally does not come easy to most people. But neither does rapid decision making of the type, say, that a professional hockey player makes, whose ability to solve problems rapidly, gives them a competitive advantage in the game. So, which is really intelligent? The slow, deliberate thinking of Albert Einstein or the rapid thinking of an NHL goalie? It seems clear that speed really does not have anything to do with what is truly going on with intelligence. And then there is Wikipedia, and they add a lot to the definition, kind of because they're an encyclopedia, not strictly a dictionary. But what they do have is what I consider the central features of intelligence in learning itself, and that is problem solving. But I want you to notice they have identified a key categorical problem between most definitions of intelligence. Some definitions conceptualize intelligence as a capacity, and others define it as an ability, which I think is a very important split because you could be looking at intelligence as something innate and fixed, like your capacity to perceive or retain information, or it's something developable, like your ability to think critically or apply logic, which, as I say it, may be a little bit confused here in the Wikipedia definition, or maybe I'm just not linguistically using the words kind of correctly in the same way. But the big idea is that some of these words that we use to define intelligence are interchangeable in the language, like capacity and ability, but their subtle differences in meaning can greatly impact your understanding of the phenomenon. Because if you interpret the definition of intelligence as a fixed quality and not an ability that is developable, you will likely struggle to understand other concepts that grow from this conceptualization, like neurodiversity. But worse, you could actually end up limiting your own growth and development, using intelligence as your justification for limiting yourself. However, I do want to say something deep about what we call bifurcated models of the mind. These are models of thinking that conceptualize the mind as an interaction between two principles. Like that first definition given by Google, I think there are several really good reasons to think that there are two distinct forms of processing going on in our brain. And one of the best reasons to think of that is just look at it. And this is why I think that out of all the definitions that I've shown you so far, Google's is the best one. It's also very close to the definition of metacognition that I present in my book, The Pedagogy of Self-Authorship. This idea that metacognition is a process of integration, integrating what you know with what you do. What we're talking about in most of these definitions of intelligence is not really intelligence, but metacognitive skills. Skills that can be developed through a process of self-reflection and self-direction. Static interpretations of skills or knowledge-based definitions of intelligence are simply wrong because both skills and knowledge are developable, not static. Intelligence is a property that spans the internal and external worlds. It is both complex and recursive structure. It seems to paradoxically require intelligence to understand intelligence. It's not a thing in the concrete sense. It's an abstract thing. It's a multi-dimensional thing that can appear differently from different perspectives. I would suggest to you that intelligence is more like a rainbow than a static skill or a base of knowledge. We can perceive intelligence just like we can perceive a rainbow. When something behaves intelligently, we can spot it, we can point to it, but it's not a solid thing. The more we try to investigate, for example, what a rainbow is or what intelligence is, the more we come to realize that what we are investigating is not simply what we are perceiving. This led to rainbows being called an illusion, which sometimes gets interpreted as meaning not real. But I want to suggest to you that rainbows are as real as any other perceptual phenomenon that we perceive. By studying rainbows, in fact, we have come to understand many of the most fundamental qualities of light in physics itself. I believe that intelligence is real in a similar way, and that the more we study it, the more it'll help us unlock fundamental qualities of the mind. However, intelligence is a perceptual thing. So, like a rainbow, if you're going to perceive it, just like a rainbow, certain conditions in the environment need to be in alignment. To perceive a rainbow, you need that rain cloud to be in front of you, the sun to be behind you. Like the kid in this picture, you will not see a rainbow if you're not looking in the right direction. But it's not just positional. You need a certain biological feature also, like the color sensitive photoreceptors that allow you to see different colors. The dog in this picture, for example, will likely not perceive the rainbow, even if he were looking right in that direction, because he lacks a full set of color receptors that we humans have. And, to say something like a mantis shrimp, which can have up to 5 times the number of photoreceptors that we have, well, they'll be able to see the rainbow, but their experience of that rainbow is going to be much different, a much different sensory experience than our own. So to see intelligence, you need these three components to be in alignment. You need your biology, your history, and your present environment to come into alignment. For example, you could imagine you could be born with, let's say, that perfect neurobiological mind for mathematics. But if you grew up in an environment with no mathematics in it, meaning, you never had a math class or a friend or a family member who, introduced you to the subject and was willing to spend time with you, well, guess what? You will be perceived to be not that intelligent in mathematics, even though your brain was initially structured to be good at it. However, you can equally imagine a person who is born without that perfect mind for math. Maybe they carry a diagnosis like dyscalculia. But if you grew up in a family that strongly valued mathematics and worked with you and you were taught math at an early age in an equally supportive environment, well, you will certainly perform better on math tests than the person from that earlier example with the perfect math mind that didn't have that, even though you were not born with that perfect math brain. In fact, I would suggest to you that there is a good chance that there might be some kinds of math problem that that person's neurodiversity actually makes them particularly proficient in and able to really demonstrate an intelligence in. And this is not hyperbole. I mean, anyone who's worked with students presenting with dyscalculia will tell you that they often have very specific weaknesses, often in calculation. They also have very distinct strengths in mathematical reasoning. And with simple accommodations or environmental changes, like being afforded the use of a calculator, well, that allows them to compensate for this weakness and perform quite intelligently on complex mathematical tasks. So here is the restorative definition of intelligence and the reasoning that this definition is built on, which is essentially that intelligence and learning are different expressions and manifestations of problem solving, because it is through the actions of problem solving that both learning and intelligence are identified. To carry out the metaphor, if intelligence is the rainbow, then learning is the rain, and problem solving is the position of the sun's rays. Learning is an internal expression of the process of applying prediction, action, and error correction to a problem. Intelligence is the external expression that can be witnessed when an agent's biology, history, and environment are coordinated or aligned to solve a kind of problem. Why does this matter? It matters because this definition, I believe, rightly replaces static definitions of intelligence and transforms the concept into something you can dramatically interact with. If learning and intelligence are just internal and external expressions of problem solving, then you can direct this problem solving process at the problems that are interfering with your expression of intelligence. This definition gives you, three distinct areas where that problem might exist. For example, maybe you have a biological problem with your attention. Well, then perhaps a stimulant like coffee or a medication like Ritalin will help. Maybe your attention problem is rooted in the way that you were raised. This can happen if you raise a child without consistent boundaries or helpful routines, that kind of thing. Not to mention how certain kinds of trauma can really just completely destroy a person's attention. Plus, there may be something going on in your very environment right now that's impacting your ability to maintain your attention. Notice the same problem could be coming from very different underlying qualities. And to make things even more complex, we have this thing called neuroplasticity, which I'll get into in a later video. But neuroplasticity can, over time, turn a problem in your environment or your history into a real biological change. As your brain grows, physical neurological connections related to those experiences. Inversely, your biology could cause you to behave in a certain way, that impacts your environment, particularly your social environment, possibly changing the way people treat you or affecting the way that your personal history starts to unfold. So how do you really know what's keeping you from showing off your true intelligence? Well, that is where problem solving comes in. When we connect learning and intelligence with its problem-solving root, then the concept of neurodiversity becomes actionable. Your neurodiversity becomes actionable. As opposed to an inactionable and stigmatized language, your intelligence becomes embodied. And what you do in this moment can both support your biological ability to solve problems, address patterns of behavior in your history, or even change your environment in ways that enhance your expression of your intelligence. The big idea here is that intelligence is something that you can build and develop. And if you have a weakness or an injury, you can be supported in that process, restoring your biology, your environment, and even your history through a natural expression of problem solving that allows you to develop and become the best version of yourself, a person capable of expressing their intelligence. So feel free to ask a question in the comments or contact me through my website. Or for a deep dive, take a look at my book or follow the movement on Substack.